Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Awakening Podcast, where I share with you the Chinese perspective on global geopolitical events. But, but today is not going to be the Chinese perspective. It's going to be my perspective. All right, on the recent tariff war. The negotiation between US and China completed in Geneva, Switzerland, with both sides reducing their tariff to pre-April 2025 percentage. A so-called 90-day truce, 90-day peace. Majority of the Chinese media celebrated this as some kind of major victory, saying that China being one of the only country in the world who refused to kneel and stood up against the bully United States. I'm rather skeptical to this result. It is a temporary ease of tension for sure, but the root problem is still there. And the way I see it, it is extremely difficult to solve. And in this video, I'm going to tell you exactly why. However, I will like to warn my new audience that unless you have been following my channel for a while now, it can be difficult for you to fully understand what I'm trying to say here. One of the key objective of this entire tariff escalation is try to maintain, or let's say rescue, the US dollar as a global reserve currency, in which US can maintain its global hegemonic position without. To better understand the core problem here between US and China, I'm going to introduce a new term here today, which I refer to as the currency circulation, the currency loop. Outside of the United States, the US dollar is used as a ruler to measure the value of a commodity or product, as a medium of exchange, and also as a way to preserve wealth. In order for it to function properly, the United States need to control the volume of US dollar in global circulation. It works sort of like the diamond business, okay? The supply need to be artificially controlled in order to maintain its value. And to control that volume, the economic interaction between the United States, the only country that can issue the US dollar, need to form a sort of closed loop currency circulation system with the rest of the world. A closed loop system is something like, let me give you guys an example. China sell, let's say, 1 billion worth of household consumer electronics to the United States every month. And the United States pay China 1 billion US dollar, right? And then China use this 1 billion US dollar to then buy 1 billion worth of, let's say, soybean agriculture products from the United States. This is a perfect 100% closed loop because no extra US dollar is added to the circulation in the global economic system. An open loop system and complete open loop system is, for example, China sell 1 billion to United States and US pay 1 billion US dollar, but US has nothing to sell to China. And then the very next month, US pay another 1 billion for Chinese goods, and this just keep going. So if the money doesn't go anywhere else, this can be considered 100% open loop, which is not sustainable for the long run, because you will eventually get to the point where there's too much US dollar chasing a finite amount of goods, destroying the ability of US dollar to hold its value intact. This is, of course, a very simple way of explaining the system. I have some previous video you guys can watch for more details. Now, there's no absolute closed loop or open loop system. It is always somewhere in between. In fact, it is good to keep the loop slightly open because the global economy is growing all the time. It requires also the US dollar as the main instrument of global exchange to expand a little with the size of the global economy to achieve an optimum result to the benefit of all nations, that is. In other words, it is often good for the US to keep a trade deflect, a small trade deflect, not too much, so it can inject the global economy with new supply of US dollars. However, the issuing of currency, the expansion of the money supply is not a pure mechanical or mathematical matter. It is an integrity matter, all right? So it is like the United States hold a credit card in its hand with no credit limit, and the rest of the world is the bank that issue the United States credit card. The United States has the duty to use that credit card responsibly and not to abuse it, or else it will screw up the rest of the world. But just like all countries and empires in history, eventually it will grow incompetent, right? It will grow lazy, grow greedy. This is not just Americans, it is human nature, it is in our DNA. So imagine there are certain amount of US dollar going around in the world, and the United States maintain a healthy overall trade balance with the rest of the world, just a small trade deficit. So it can inject the global economy with that, extra energy, right? But what is going on now is that the US as a single body has overexpand that money supply. It consumed much more than it can afford. And this reflect in currency circulation as leaning towards an open loop. You have US dollar going out and not circulating back. And eventually that will break the equilibrium and collapse the US dollar in the international market. The United States leadership understand that. It doesn't matter if it's Biden administration, Obama, or Trump. They all understand this logic. Well, how do you fix the problem then? There are usually three ways to fix the problems, okay? Three and a half actually, to make it more this kind of closed loop instead of open. There's the conventional way, there's the unconventional way, and there's also the artificial way to close the loop. And tariff being the half method that I mentioned, all right, is the half solution. The conventional way is the one I just mentioned. US sell electronics to the United States, and US sell agricultural product back to China. This is how most people come to understand what trade is. This is a win-win situation for both. They will improve the standard of living on both sides. And this is done voluntarily, okay, not by force. So if China sell, let's say, 1 billion worth of electronics to US, and US force China to buy US grown soybeans at, let's say, 5 times the price, the average market price, that's not trade, that's colonialism, okay? It is like the British Empire forced China to buy opium in exchange for silver and other Chinese goods. So in a conventional way, market compete freely and motivate countries to invest in productivity, efficiency, and quality, so on. The problem with this conventional way is that US dollar as a fiat sovereign currency, but also as a global traded, currency, it is too toxic for the United States to operate over the long run. It is like those narcotic drugs, going back to the metaphor of unlimited credit card US is holding. Why would you invest in your own education? Why would you spend, let's say, 10 years in law school or medical school to get a higher earning job for a higher standard of living, if your dad or a bank just hand you a credit card with low limit? In that case, you will eventually just build your lifestyle around that credit card, right? Your focus will be shift from not whether you are a useful contributor to the society, but focus on how to make sure this credit card works and eliminate any threat that will stop you from using this credit card to its full potential. So to cut the explanation short, The US has developed into a position that most of the things US produce is no longer competitive on the global market because US dollar value is artificially appreciated, and also US having the luxury of owning this reserve currency got lazy and also failed to invest in long-term productivity and competitiveness. I don't want to go too deep here. I know you guys watch a video, let's say from Ray Dalio's, but you get my point here. Okay, so United States in this situation cannot tighten the loop with conventional method. Now it has to move to the unconventional method. What are those? Well, reroute the trade by using questionable tactics. For example, blowing up gas pipelines. The US run 100 billion plus trade deficit against the EU every year. It lacks the conventional way to circulate those currency back to the United States. So it has to create demand through unconventional means to help Europeans switch their buyer, habit and how they spend their money. One way is to buy gas from the United States, buy energy from the United States. Another way is to buy weapons. So how do you create that demand? Well, you have to find more questionable ways to do that. There are other unconventional ways to manufacture war or drive tension between countries so US can sell weapons to those countries at a huge premium. This is a common tactic used by the United States across the world. Uh, for example, there's a very interesting relationship between mainland China and Taiwan. Many of you guys do not know, okay? If you look at the trade balance between those two, China runs a trade deficit versus Taiwan, an amount of over 100 billion US dollar per year. All right. So China's trade deficit against Taiwan over the last 20 years on average is as big as the trade deficit between US and Europe. Do you guys know that? And that's intentional. It's kind of like a hidden agreement, even I would say, between the three, the China, Taiwan, and US. Because the United States runs a huge trade deficit against China, it doesn't have conventional ways to loop those currency back. It can't use unconventional method on China because US can't really sell weapons to China, at least not the ones that China wants. US cannot blow up pipeline between China and Russia. Not today, at least, unless it want to have huge consequences. So the tension between Taiwan and China is very important in order for US to balance its trade. Because to maintain the tension between Taiwan and China, US can then encourage Taiwan to purchase more military equipment from the United States. And in order to purchase more from US, Taiwan need to run a trade surplus against other countries, especially against China. So you can have the money, to purchase and buy those US equipment. If you look at the trade policy between China and Taiwan, Taiwan intentionally put import restriction on many Chinese products. There are many Chinese goods, agriculture goods, electronics, and many others, let's say EVs. Taiwanese government basically banned those products outright as long as they come from China in order to force a trade surplus against China. This ultimately has a deep impact on Taiwanese standard of living since they have to put aside a lot of purchasing power to buy weapons and not spend on social benefits and well-beings. US is doing the same with Europe right now by provoking this Ukraine war. North Korea has been used as an unconventional way to circulate currency from South Korea and Japan back to the United States. And CIA operated terrorist groups are used to circulate money out of the Middle East. You can see this as a mafia style business model to create violence to balance this trade deficit. This is what I will consider the unconventional way. Now, there's a third method, which I call it artificial method. You guys usually call it the American financial market, Ponzi scheme, right? China sell to US 1 billion worth of electronics, and US has nothing to pay China for, or at least not enough to close the loop. So US sent Janet Yellen to China to ask, to beg, to sometimes threaten China to buy US Treasury bond to circulate those money back to the United States to close the loop. Japan, also one of the biggest buyer of US Treasury bond. I'll be going to Japan next month. Looking at the world today from a per capita standpoint, Saudi Arabia is the biggest contributor to US standard of living and prosperity from a currency circulation standpoint. The petrodollar serve as a way to help other countries to dump their, extra dollars into buying energy, which then converted into US dollar and, recycle into the US financial market. Japan, on the other hand, suffered the most, I would say, to keep US dollar afloat because Japanese people don't sit on trillions of oil reserve. They have to work their ass off to earn their living. And yet, per capita wise, they gave the most to the United States. So Japan, from an economic standpoint, is like America's blood bank. US is the vampire that sucked the nutrition from the Japanese people and the Japanese economy. China also contribute a lot, but China is a big country with 1.4 billion population, so the effect is not as impactful in comparison to Japan, and depending on how you see it, not yet at least I would say. So this is what I call the third method, the artificial method. All right. As you guys can see, the conventional method is the only win-win situation here, which is how international trade should be conducted. And everyone should agree with me on this, right? The unconventional method and the artificial method is more of a evolution of a colonial economic architecture for Americans who have difficulty swallow this narrative or this concept. I can say this is basically United States taxing other countries by force, and this is tax without representation, which is something Americans fought against the British Empire to gain its independence. Not to mention, this system is also the fundamental reason why the income inequality around the world and also now in the United States is very uneven. So ever since Nixon left the gold standard, and also because of the rise of China and the entire global South, America become weaker and weaker when it comes to conventional method to close that dollar loop, which is normal by the way, because in terms of total productivity, in relationship to the rest of the world, United States contribution has been reducing. It's totally normal. United States only has, 5% of the global population. So for Americans to balance the trade, now the conventional method to close that dollar loop is no longer working that well. It has to resolve more and more by using unconventional methods and artificial methods. And as I explained here, this is not a win-win situation. This is a win-lose situation. And if this is kept in place over a long duration, it is basically colonialism, just camouflage under the disguise of neoliberalism or some national security excuse or different dressing depending on which president you have. When Scott Bessent recently in one of his interview video I watched, he said that all of the countries in the world, China is the biggest problem when it comes to trade imbalance and all kind of imbalance in relationship to the United States. And I 100% agree with him because China has become so efficient at production. US has to buy from China for most of its product. And for many products, there's not even an alternative option in some cases. US cannot balance it with conventional way. US can use unconventional way either. The unconventional way only work against smaller countries. This Iran and North Korea boogeyman tactic narrative doesn't work against a country as big as China. The artificial method, the money Ponzi scheme method, that used to be the primary method when it comes to China. But now, due to recent tension, China is refusing to obey US as well. So all three methods do not work with China, and that makes China the biggest open loop in US global neo-colonial monetary architecture. And now we get to the tariff. If you cannot close the loop, now what do? You try to stop dollar going into China to begin with, right? Because once it goes there, it won't come out. To make the situation worse, with the trade surplus, China is running around the world buying assets and doing business with other partners using the US dollars. It's not just keeping it in a vault, which means that US has to spend extra effort running around the world to try to circulate those dollars back. And with China's industrial supremacy and US declining conventional way of trade capability, it has to utilize more aggressive means, more unconventional and artificial means in order to get those US dollar back. You guys can see the relationship now, right? Very important statement I will make here. The less cooperative China is to the United States, the less obedience, the more political and military aggression US will have to take around the planet in order to offset China. You can pause the video and think about this to digest what I just said here, okay? So if you ask me this Geneva tariff, negotiation, who won, China or the United States? My answer will be is inconclusive. Maybe Trump embarrassed himself by heightening, the tariff and lower it so quickly. But the United States did not really lose because what US did here, not just now with the tariff, but over the last 8 years since Trump's first term, it is a legit tactic. So if Donald Trump and Scott Bessent hires me, okay, and tell me that, hey, Richard, your job is to safeguard the US empire and the US dollar. This is one of the things I will do as well. Not the only thing. I will do other things, but I might be successful, I might not. So if you look closely today, US tariff on China as of this moment, even after lowering the tariff to, pre-April 2025, is still higher than almost any countries around the world, in addition to many, many sanctions that has been added to China over the years. This is not about reindustrializing, the United States. What this does is forcing business and production out of China to other countries where US can easily impose unconventional and artificial method to balance the trade and close the loop because US can do those methods on China. This is US trying to protect its own neo-colonial economic zone, economic commonwealth by, kicking China out of the system. So I can't really say this is a win for China because China did not force US to lower the tariff to a level that at least equal to other nations around the world. Of course, the Chinese representatives said that they are satisfied with the result and seems very happy. So there might be a lot of hidden terms that we don't know in which US agreed with China. For example, regarding Taiwan.
Trump's recent choice of words for describing U.S. China trade ties are turning heads here in Taiwan.
And they've agreed to open China, fully open China. And I think it's going to be fantastic for China. I think it's going to be fantastic for us. And I think it's going to be great for unification and peace.
Trump was speaking on a US China trade deal to temporarily cut tariffs for 90 days, but his use of the words unification and peace have caused worry about potential US concessions to China's territorial claims over Taiwan.
I want to end this video by making a few important points, and this is not just to Americans and to Chinese, this is to everyone around the world. First, unconventional method and artificial method and tariff are all short-term temporary solutions. It is used to offset a nation's lack of ability to balance its trade through conventional means. And only conventional trade should be encouraged for us collective human beings, because that's the only win-win situation for everyone. It is the moral correct way of doing business. Second, for the United States of America to become less colonial, to build up America's capability to balance its trade through conventional ways, which I believe Americans would like to see that as well, require US to seriously overhaul its domestic economic structure in many fronts, something that is unfortunate to say, unlikely to happen unless US face this kind of Great Depression scenario, because only in those circumstances people will be willing to come together and accept a new deal, a new deal 2.0, to reform healthcare system, military and financial system, to make them less predatory to domestic and foreign economy. So United States can function that way as a more balanced and less aggressive way. And final point, and this is important, I want to show you guys what this tariff negotiation between China and US will eventually lead to, regarding how the world will move forward from now on. I can't predict the future, but I can roughly predict what future might look like depending on the tariff outcome, all right? Scenario one, if after negotiation, more negotiation this year, US agreed to lower tariff on China to a level roughly equal to the rest of the world, that will mean a major victory for China, definitely, but the problem for US monetary system will remain and will get worse in an accelerating pace. US might be forced into a military gamble somewhere, which, if it fails, will lead to further collapse. Might be or might not be a good thing for the United States. It won't be good for US if it breaks apart. It might be good if it forces internal reform, something Trump does not have the capability or desire to do at this moment, depending on whether you like Trump or not. Scenario two is that if tariff on China remains and continue to increase over the next few years, let's say 5 to 10% per year, then China will eventually have to go its separate way and run its own financial and monetary system. In that case, we are looking at a fractured world, a new Cold War, basically, with a separated economic bloc, because US cannot hope to compete with China in its own current form without drawing ideological boundaries for its own economic zone. In the long run, however, there's the problem of whether each of these economic body will be sustainable. So it's not like one side will win because of that result. It really depends on how the two parties manage its own relative, economic zone to see how those systems can be feasible. Scenario three, which is a scenario I prefer the most, is the two nations' negotiation eventually lead to an entire global economic trade restriction and reset. We will have a Bretton Woods 2.0, a new architecture born from a peaceful agreement among all major powers. And historically speaking, that won't happen without some major war, but who knows? We might be able to achieve that since there are so many nuclear warheads in the world right now, it is not possible to have all-out great power war without mutual destruction. So it is best to settle down and reach a peaceful agreement. That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will see you guys all in the next video.